for this wonderful introduction. One thing I definitely should say that it was by no means single-handedly. It was a team effort, and you were part of that team from very early on, as well as all the other people and many other people in this room. So let me basically take you through a few slides about the achievements of work in the labor markets. We use that as a shorthand for actually quite a broader set of topics that we work on in this area. So it's labor, human development, it is demography, it is issues of household economics, and so sometimes poverty is covered by this area, although later on we've had inequality kind of split off and gender split off a little bit, but they've all really been part of this general area of research in what we call labor for shorthand in ERF. So essentially, and it has been a central theme of ERF's work from the very beginning. I remember when Assaad Diwan came to me and two other colleagues in 1992 and asked us to write the kind of thematic paper on what should ERF do in the labor and human resource area. And we did, and it was one of the papers presented at the founding conference. It has been a theme of the parallel sessions of ERF from the very beginning, and it also became a thematic area in the research initiative for Arab development. Initially it wasn't, but then the management in its wisdom felt that it really belonged there and it should be there. And then finally it is currently one of the areas in the ASDI, which is a successor program to Riyadh. So very central to ERF work, and from the very beginning we had identified three challenges. Essentially, we lived in a very data-poor region. So there was a complete scarcity of good data that is essential to do cutting-edge work in labor. As a result, I think, of this data scarcity, we had weak capacity. Good researchers, good economists simply avoided this area. They couldn't do cutting-edge work. They went into trade, they went into finance, they went into macroeconomics, and avoided this area. So we had weak capacity that I think derives from the data scarcity. And as a result of that, very little published work, despite the very obvious importance of the problems in labor markets that the region suffers from. So we then set out to have a three-pronged agenda. You can imagine it's going to try to deal with those three challenges. Provide much greater access to high-quality microdata on these topics, primarily by providing access to data from household surveys. Build research capacity in labor economics, applied microeconometrics and policy analysis, and also other related fields like demographic, population economics, etc. And then finally, substantially increase the quality and volume of research on labor market and human resource development. So let me cover each of these in turn. So first, in terms of access to high quality data, so we couldn't get access to official data. The official statistical offices simply would not give us the data, and if they gave them, it was on a private basis to their favored researchers, one person here, one person there, but there wasn't no, especially for a young researcher coming on, there was no way to get the data unless you stole it. In fact, I was accused of stealing my first microdata set, and I was called the data vulture within an ERF context. But in any case, so we had to do something about it. And something about it was that we designed and implemented our own set of surveys in cooperation with national statistical offices, and basically made that data very quickly after it became available to the internal team, made it available within 1 year to the public and to researchers in general. And these are referred to as the ERF labor market panel surveys, which I'll describe a little bit more in a minute. But also in parallel with that, we made sure that we worked with national statistical offices to basically make harmonized microdata from official surveys available to researchers in a way that can compare both across countries and over time. Initially, we had a number of meetings, starting with a meeting in Ifrane, Morocco in the year 2000. In fact, there might have been a meeting before that, where we would just gather the officials, the presidents and the vice presidents of these statistical offices, and try to just pitch the idea of open access microdata, and try to have them, those who are more open, to influence those who are less open, and try to get movement. We didn't go very far, but we kept at it for several years, inviting them to the annual conferences, having special sessions on open access data. This all culminated in the establishment of this incredible initiative. I described it yesterday in a very small meeting, not as the best in MENA, definitely by far in terms of making microdata available to researchers, but among the best in the world. And I think it's really proven to be an incredible resource. So I would encourage you to go and visit that site and see the wonderful data that is now available. In fact, now we could be even considered data rich as a result of all these initiatives. Now, in terms of the ERF labor market surveys, we carried out 3 in Egypt with the 1998, 2006, and 2012. And these are designed as a panel so that you can follow the same households and the same individuals over time, allowing us to do dynamic labor market research. Each of the surveys also includes significant retrospective questions that ask about people's labor market histories, as well as their education history, their marital history, their so-called life course, so that we can tie different aspects of their lives together. We also did a Jordan survey in 2010, and you have the sample sizes there. The second wave of the Jordan survey is planned for this year. We are, in fact, in advanced stages of preparation for the Jordan survey, and the contract with the Jordanian government is supposed to be signed any moment now, I understand. And then we did, the last one we carried out was in Tunisia in 2014, and in fact we spent all day yesterday on a workshop looking at papers that emerged from that data as a first cut analysis before we put the data up as a public resource this August. So in August, at the same time as the Tunisia survey goes up, we will also put up what's called the ILMPS, which stands for Integrated Labor Market Panel Surveys, which will harmonize across all of these data sets so that you can seamlessly do cross-country comparisons across these very rich data sets. Second issue is capacity building. And so while part of the belief is that if you make the data, if you build it, they will come. If you make the data available, as Ahmed likes to say, researchers are like bees, they come to the honey. We thought we needed also some training in order to work with researchers on the use of microdata for human development. And that also started very early on in the history of ERF. So we had a number of workshops on use of household survey data for policy analysis. And of course, Insan and Javad were involved. And before that, Radwan Shaban was involved in those, starting with Cairo as early as 1995. We had a summer institute in Istanbul in 98. We had another workshop in 99, in Sana'a in 2000, and Ifrane and Ifrane also in 2000. Then we had some workshops on specifically how to do data documentation and dissemination. These are for national statistical offices, so that they learn what the international standards are for creating metadata and making data available. We had several workshops on analysis of retrospective data. I only have one listed here because I couldn't recall exactly whether we did it in 2014 or I think we had 3, in fact, so 2 of these. We had a workshop on measuring, 3 workshops on measuring inequality and inequality of opportunity using microdata. And then just most recently, an applied econometrics and public policy evaluation training workshop, which will be repeated again this summer. So a lot, and I probably left out many others in this area, but I have to say I tried to do my research on the ERF website, but the website was not as helpful as I was hoping. So on the last point, before I get into some of the insights we gained from the research, we had a whole bunch of research competitions to encourage people to use this new data, whether it's research using labor market panel surveys. We had open competitions for people who would be using the household income and consumption surveys. We had ones on specific topics like education, impact of labor market regulation and institutions. Labor demand is the most recent one as an open competition. But besides this one mechanism of research competitions, we also had a number of directed research projects. And again, this is a relatively small sample. The most recent ones were one on labor market dynamics, which was just completed, and one that is currently being on course in economics of the life course in the ERF region, but also projects jointly with the inequality theme on inequality of opportunity and other topics. And then we have the conference call for papers every year where the labor theme, essentially nearly half of the papers that end up being presented in the labor theme, I counted from a third to a half, depending on the year, are based on data that is disseminated now by ERF. So it really has created, now in terms of the research output, if I could count 80 working papers on the ERF website that are in labor and demographic economics. We have them listed by JEL classification. There are 20 additional working papers on health, education, and welfare. There is an average of 8 to 10 papers per annual conference in this theme, and at least 3 research workshops a year on this topic. 4 edited volumes have been produced so far. Shameless advertising. Here are 3 on the Egyptian labor market, 2 on the Egyptian labor market, and 1 on the Jordanian labor market. The last one being 2015, and we have 1 planned for the Tunisian labor market, which we're working on. So, but my main point here is really that new data allows for new kinds of analyses. And early this morning, you heard about in the plenary session about some of the features that typify this region in terms of the labor market: low participation rates among women, high unemployment among youth and among educated youth in particular, large government, public sectors, etc. So I'm not going to go over these various features, but I will try to see how we could use these access to these new data to do dynamic analyses rather than analyzing stocks over time, but to look at flows in the labor market, because really that's the novelty that this data is allowing us to do. And panel data that ERF produced are completely unique in the MENA region. But even when panel data is not yet available, let's say just as in the case of Jordan and Tunisia, where we haven't yet done the second wave of the panel, there is a lot of retrospective information from the surveys that can be used to do dynamic analysis. And we did a check to try and check how reliable some of this retrospective information is. And it is reliable in some important variables that we want to look at. In particular, people remember what kind of job transitions, but they don't necessarily remember how long they were unemployed in 1995. So there are some things that definitely suffer from recall, but others that are not. So what the data particularly can do is to study interlinkages between different topics within kind of labor and household economics. So we have a lot of work on school-to-work transition. How do young people make it to their first job? What kind of first job? Where do they eventually end up? We have a lot of work on employment and marriage, but employment and other life course events like fertility, etc. We have issues on women's employment and empowerment within the household, and a lot of research on that. As you'll hear from Jackie later on, we have a number of papers on migration and how it connects to entrepreneurship and employment in that direction. So let me show you some of my favorite graphs. And I like to say those are my favorite graphs that illustrate the value of this data. And I'll go through some of these. Insan cuts me off whenever the time is up. So this is a graph based on a cross-sectional survey from Jordan, which is able to extract the dynamics of the Jordanian labor market in terms of how the labor market changed quite dramatically over time by looking at the first job that people obtain and then the date at which they obtained this job, and classifying the first job as being either government, formal private, informal private, self-employed, unpaid, etc. And even if there are inaccuracies in some of the recall, there is a clear pattern where in Jordan, government was stable for a while, and then in the early 1980s, government hiring started dropping precipitously, and what took its place is the formal private sector, quite a strong response by the formal private sector growing, although upon greater examination, it's mostly definite duration contracts in the formal private sector. So Jordan managed to get a tool by which it had a fairly flexible contract in the private sector that a lot of people were, so it's formal employment in the private sector. And I want to distinguish between employment and the sector itself. So these are people with social insurance, that blue curve that's going up. Now, in contrast, this is Egypt. So Egypt has had the same, I'm talking here about secondary education and above, so graduates primarily. So the first jobs for Egyptians were nearly over 70% in the public sector early on, if you had a secondary degree and above, and by the most recent data, you're all down to 20%. So that precipitous decline in public sector opportunities is replaced by what? By an increase in informal wage employment. So Egypt, in contrast to Jordan, has had a dramatic informalization of its labor market, which has, of course, tremendous consequences, as we saw in a paper earlier today in the labor session, on labor force participation. Women simply don't like or avoid these informal jobs because they're too risky as far as their futures are concerned. So let me show you another. This is now looking at trying to get at dynamics again by looking at job creation. And again, this is from retrospective panel data, so it might suffer from some recall error. But you can see that there is a clear decline in the rate at which the working age population in Egypt is growing. And that is because of the youth bulge having already moved into the prime work years, and the next generation of 15 to 24-year-olds is smaller, and so you have a slowdown in labor supply for a while. It will reverse later as we get the echo from the youth bulge. But the most interesting thing is that net job creation was keeping up with it up to around 2009, 2010, and then net job creation started dropping precipitously as a result before the revolution. So we detect already a slowdown in job creation and job exit going up significantly in that period, while job entry or gross job creation remaining fairly flat. So we could say that even before the revolution, we could see already a signal of job exits increasing. This is showing basically what happens to people over time. And this is their movements from either they move to they stay in the same job, they move to another job, they move to unemployment, or they move out of the labor force. And you can see, of course, that for women, a much higher probability of moving out of the labor force. For men, if anything, they move from job to job. But the significant piece of this graph is a lot of people stay in the same job for a long time. Now, what about those who move? So is it involuntary or voluntary movements? And from this graph comparing Egypt and Tunisia, the three darker colors are involuntary moves. And you can see that a small proportion of job moves or job separations are due to involuntary. Most of the time people leave. Either they leave to go to another job, that's voluntary to employment, voluntary to O, which is out of the labor force, and voluntary to U, which is unemployment. So the takeaway from this graph is very few people get unemployed because they lose their jobs. In this region, unemployment is an entry phenomenon. It's primarily people who are looking for their first job rather than losing a job in order to become unemployed. And that's part of the rigidity of the labor market. Once you get a job, you're in there. Now, in this graph, we're trying to look at the transition to first employment and how it changed across generations. And how it changed across generations and by education. And we're even introducing in the same graph social class. So let me try to explain. So in both the males 25 to 34 and the males 45 to 54, we're looking at in first jobs. What is the first job that people got upon entry into the labor market? So they're both looking at the kind of the school to work transition period if they did go to school. And the interesting part is that if you had less than secondary education in both generations, you essentially got informal employment, either in the form of family business, irregular wage work, or informal wage work in an informal firm. Very few people, the pink and red at the top are the formal, essentially formal private and formal public. And that hasn't changed. If you still don't have an education and you're young, you have the same prospects, very few prospects of getting. But if you're in the older generation and you had some education, especially some secondary education, you had a nearly 40 or little above 40% chance of getting formal employment. Now it's almost none at all. It's about 15, 14% chance. But as you can see, as you go up in education, the chance of getting formal employment has declined significantly as you go from the older group, 45 to 54, to the younger group. However, the people who are still doing fairly well are those who have a university education and whose father has a secondary education or above. So people from an upper social class who get a university education still have a pretty good chance of doing well in the labor market. But people from a lower social class who get an upper or university education are actually doing much worse in the labor market. And you can understand some of the frustration that people were sold the bill of goods. If you get that degree, you'll get to be part of the middle class, and they never make it. Now, for women, it's quite different. And for women, there is another option besides getting informal employment, which is not working. And you can see here that over time for women, the proportion not working is increasing. And it's because the job market is offering them jobs that are below the reservation working conditions, and they're turning down those jobs. And so it used to be that educated women, those with post-secondary education, were working at very high rates. And as time goes on, that rate is declining quite significantly. Now, less educated women, they weren't working before, they're not working now. Or if they did work, they worked for as unpaid workers in their families. Okay, so now I told you about first jobs. But what about later? What happens to people over time in the labor market? And the surveys allow us to check that as well. So here we're looking at the distribution of the proportion of people who get government as their first job, and this is in the case of Jordan, and then where they are, and then the proportion of people that have government as their job after 5 years, and then the proportion of people that has government as their job after 10 years. And you can see that in Jordan, it used to be that you got in the government from your first job right away until about 1990, and then after that, you had to wait for your government job. So you didn't get it initially, but after 5 years, you got it. Some people even waited longer than 5 years, and you can see the curve going up in Jordan. So queuing for government job was still paying off in Jordan all the way to 2010, because you had a chance of getting, or at least 2005. Now in Egypt, you see a very different story. the proportion getting government jobs as a first job first increased and then was decreasing. And this is among all workers. And you can see that waiting was paid off in the 70s and 80s, as after 5 years the proportion is higher, and after 10 years it's even higher. So there's a period of time in between the mid-70s and the mid-90s where it was worth waiting for a government job in Egypt. You had a chance of getting it after you waited long enough, whereas later on that disappeared. The proportion getting government jobs did not go up whether you spent 5 years or been 10 years into the labor market. So this is really, now, we also can look at how persistent unemployment is, and we know that in this region, unemployment lasts a long time for first-time entrants. They tend to take a long time to find their first job, and but what struck me is that waiting time in Tunisia is, in fact, there are some people who get jobs right away, but then some people who wait a very long time, much more so than in Jordan and Egypt. And in particular, you see that those waiting times are very long for females. Actually, the females sometimes drop out altogether from the job market, and rather than wait. Now, let me move to the connection between employment and this is again, this was in the presentation that my co-author did in the previous session, but I'm going to show it again because I love this graph. Somebody who loves graphs, what kind of life do they have? But so this is one in which we say, we look at women who are married, currently married, and say we set time 0, which is the year they got married. And we look at 10 years prior to the time they got married and up to 10 years after the time of marriage. So the time scale is measured by the age of marriage, and we see what they were doing. And this is the proportion that is in public, non-wage, and wage. Category is either unemployment or out of the labor force. Those are the two that are not shown on these graphs. So you can see that there is an increase in pretty much all 3 of these categories before marriage, with somewhat flatter for non-wage. In Tunisia and Jordan, private wage employment increases quite a bit. But in all 3 countries, the year the woman gets married, there's a big jump downwards in private wage employment, and that is not the case in either public employment or non-wage work. So only private employment is what people leave at marriage. And of course, the size of the jump is quite large in relative terms in Egypt and Jordan, but the critical lesson I get from this is what happens after marriage. In Tunisia, eventually that curve starts climbing up again. So women are returning to private wage employment. By 8 years beyond marriage, they're back at the same level they were just before marriage. So they've had their 2 children, and that's where the fertility rate in Tunisia is 2.1, and they've gone to school, and finally they can get back to work. Whereas in Jordan, the curve keeps going down. So they keep leaving those private sector jobs and not returning. In Egypt, it's flat, and only non-wage work is increasing. So at least Egyptian women seem to have non-wage work as an option after marriage. They can work from home, but Jordanian women do not seem to have that option. So I've shown you at least a selection of what we can do. Okay, one more, since I haven't gotten the signal yet from Insan. This is about the double burden. So we have hours of domestic work and hours of market work for women who are employed and not employed, and unmarried and married. So we can compare. And the key takeaway from here is that first we look at the blue being the hours of domestic work. The hours of domestic work in all 3 countries go up significantly with marriage. So there's in Tunisia, it goes from about 10 to about 22 or 21, more than double. In Jordan, it goes from about 17 for both groups to about 38 hours per week. And in Egypt, it goes from about 15 to about 30, also double. Now, the interesting thing here is that the difference in hours of domestic work between employed and not employed women is almost none. So domestic work is completely inelastic. It will not change. There's a certain burden of work responsibilities that married women have to do, and whether they work or not, they seem to have to do it. Now, luckily in Tunisia, it's a lot less than it is in Egypt, and that's a lot somewhat less than it is in Jordan, and that could explain very well why women in Tunisia are more likely to go back to private sector wage work. So I've shown you at least what excites me about some of the results that we were able to obtain. I think that we can owe the success of the ERF in this area to the three-pronged strategy. There are three legs of one stool. If you remove any one of the legs, the stool will fall. And so I think we need to keep going on all three. And so building research infrastructure is extremely important, especially when it's not present through the official sources, but it must be accompanied by capacity building and effective mentoring to get good quality research. Thank you.